Now that we have taken a look at the structure of our project, and that we have learned about the main page.saml being the file that is going to define the structure and the UI of the first page to appear when the app is open, it's time for us to design what is going to appear in that first page. And for that, in this lecture, we're going to start learning SAML. SAML is going to be the language that we're going to be using to define the UI when it comes to Xamarin Forms. And the great thing about it is that we only have to define it once for it to run on Android and iOS. And what is even better is that whatever we define will look native on each of the platforms, meaning that this is not some abstraction of the elements that are going to just look like whatever SAML wants, but that will actually be rendered as native elements. So for example, if you have a button defined on SAML, on Android you will see it the way an Android button looks, and on iOS you will see it the way an iOS button looks. So to get started with SAML, we're going to be creating an app that will allow the user to write their names down, click a button, and receive a greeting. For this, we're going to need three elements. We're going to need a label to displaying the greeting. We're going to need a text box for the user to write their names down. And we're going to need a button, which the user will be able to click so the label greets them with the name that they wrote down inside of the text box. So I have here already the main page open, and we can see that the first element is already covered. We already have a label in here and already has some text. We will need to change this text eventually, but right now it works. It says, "Welcome to Xamarin Forms." It is also vertically centered and horizontally centered. I want you to take a brief look at how this label is structured. First, we have the open definition of the label. Then we have three properties that are highlighted in red, and their values, which are in blue. And finally, a closing tag. Also notice that the label is inside of a content page. The definition is very similar, except that the closing tag is all the way to the bottom instead of on the same line or in the same bunch of code. In this case, the closing line does require the name of the element that is being closed, contrary to what we see on the label, which only requires the closing tag to be like this. With this basic knowledge, let's define our first SAML element, and that is going to be the text box. To define a text box in SAML, we have to define an entry, like this. We start with an open angle bracket, we write down the name of the element that we want to define, and then we can close the definition with a slash. Notice that Visual Studio has auto-completed the closing of the element with that closing angle bracket. It's in here where we can also define the values for some properties. For an entry, for example, we may want to establish the placeholder, which is the value that the user will see inside of the entry without it being text, to let them know what exactly they are supposed to write down inside of that entry. In this case, the placeholder will assign it to write your name. Notice that to set the value for some property, all we do is write down the property name, write down equal, the double quotes are automatically added by Visual Studio, and inside of the double quotes, we write down the value that we want. Let's now define a button. And we do that, again, with the opening angle bracket. We write down button, and we can close the definition. For the button, the property that we need to set is the text property. That is going to be called the exact same way as the text property of the label, and that will establish the value that is going to be displayed inside of the button. We can do it by writing down equal. The double quotes are added automatically, and in this case, we're going to write down say hello. By now, we already have the definition, the basic definition of our user interface. When we test this out, we will find if it actually looks the way we want, and in case it doesn't, we will have to change it a little bit. But before moving forward, there is another thing that we have to do. And that is to add some way of knowing when the button is pressed, because currently, all we have is the interface, not really the functionality. And the entire functionality we're going to write down in the next lecture. But for this lecture, I do want to have the setting complete. And for that, we need an event handler. An event handler is going to be a bunch of code that is going to be executed every time something happens, every time an event fires. And in the case of a button, the event that we want to control is the clicked event. And we can set that also from SAML. We can write down clicked, which is the name of the event, and that is going to respond to when the user clicks on the button, and assign it to an event handler. The name for this event handler, I want it to be button_clicked. And now the button has an event handler assigned to its clicked event. But now we have to define this event handler. And the event handler has to be defined inside of the C# file that comes with the main page.saml file. So let's go to our Solution Explorer and expand the shared project, and in here expand the main page.saml file. In here we will find the C# file, which we are going to open, and it's in here where we want to define the event handler. The event handler has to be called the exact same way that we said from SAML, so let's go ahead and copy the name and head back to C#. We're going to define this event handler right below this main page bunch of code. So right after this closing bracket, I'm going to add some spacing in here, and I'm going to write down void, and I'm going to paste the name of the event handler, and then I'm going to add some parentheses. In here, I am going to add a couple of things. First, an object, which I'm going to call sender, which in this case is just going to refer to the button. And then some event args. Notice that as soon as I start typing, Visual Studio will help me autocomplete. So all I need to do is press tab on my keyboard when I find event args, and then just name this E. And then I'm going to add these brackets. Now I know that this may be a little bit overwhelming right now. Bear with me. We're going to learn exactly what is going on in here in the C# section. Right now, let's just keep in mind that this bunch of code is going to be executed every single time the user clicks the button. And that is because this bunch of code is the event handler that we're going to be setting as the event handler for the clicked event. Let's now go ahead and save the changes. You can save all by clicking on this icon in Visual Studio, or you can go to each of the files and press Command S on your keyboard. So during this lecture, we have defined the user interface for our main page. We have added an entry and a button, along with the label that was already there by default. So we have learned a little bit about SAML. And we have also created a bunch of code that we mentioned is going to be executed every time the user clicks on the button, because this bunch of code is going to act as an event handler. And we have set this event handler to be the one that is executed every time the clicked event is fired. In the next lecture, we're going to start using this event handler that we created to write down the functionality of the application, which will have to get the value that the user writes down on the entry and display a greeting inside of the label.